I wanted to acknowledge that Boxo Project is located on the traditional lands of the Serrano, the Chimawave, and the Kawia people, and invite you to consider whose land you're located on. So it's a great pleasure, as I said, to introduce you to this project brought to me by Sebastian and Georgia. Georgia McGovern is an artist based in New York and in Vermont, and Sebastijan Jemec is a designer also based in New York. Sebastian and Georgia approached me some time back and became visiting artists at Joshua Tree when they described this wonderful project to me, and I was very welcome to host them here as they developed it. So the program for today, we're going to see a film. We're going to start out by watching a film about the project. The film is by M. Joseph, who's an artist, filmmaker, and educator. We're going to watch the film, which will introduce us to the project in sort of a very concrete way and get us situated. And then we'll turn over the proceedings to M, Sebastian, and Georgia for a conversation about the project. And then after that, we'll go to Q&A. So feel free to put any questions you have in the chat box as we go along, or we can do that, as we get to the Q&A and it goes live.
Terra Incognita Joshua Tree is the first iteration of this project. It is located in a boulder field on public land adjacent to the Joshua Tree National Park. During numerous research visits from 2018 to 2020, we designed a site-specific, lightweight tent fitted to work in one specific boulder formation. This tent will not work anywhere else as it relies on the particular rock structure to hold itself up. The project is not just the tent, but the whole experience of hiking to the site and participating in the landscape, setting up and sleeping in the tent, exploring the area, engaging with the elements, the flora and fauna, and specific boulders that make up the site for the shelter. This project explores themes of rewilding, public and private land, geology and ecology, outdoor recreation, participatory art, shelter, the elements, and human scale.
We were motivated to create a site-specific tent that would immerse users in the local conditions of Joshua Tree at a micro level. The ideal site had to meet a number of parameters. The tent site had to be large enough for 2 people to sleep in, and it had to provide shelter and shade with a sense of security. It had to be on public land where camping was permitted. This brought up issues of public versus private land. We decided to look in one section of Bureau of Land Management public land that was adjacent to the national park in the local conservation area, and accessible without encroaching on private land.
The first step to making the tent was to measure the site. We initially used strings to simplify and triangulate the shape. We measured the lengths and angles with rulers, tape measures, and protractors, and then made hand-drawn diagrams. This manual measuring forced us to get very intimate with the geometry and surfaces of the site.
We then translated the diagrams into 3D modeling software and generated a potential tent shape.
We created patterns and fabricated a prototype tent that we took to Joshua Tree and tested. We returned and 3D scanned the boulder formation and generated a highly accurate digital 3D model of the site.
The site specificity would magnify the immersive experience and highlight the micro in the macro. This meant that the tent needed to be as minimally there as possible, so it felt like you were truly in and among the boulders. We needed to consider the elements, mainly the strong winds, the sand, and the heat. It was essential that it be user-friendly and be seen as a functional piece of equipment, not just some conceptual art piece. This meant the tent had to be made from technical fabrics for it to be lightweight and packable, and it needed to be somewhat easy to set up. We looked at modern backpacking tents for reference. The tent had to minimally impact the site. The rocks, soil, flora, and fauna, the whole ecosystem is fragile in extreme places like this. We aimed to adhere to leave no trace principles.
After much thought, we decided to make the tent a warm yellow, as that is a common color of flora in the high desert, and also the rocks contain a lot of yellow and red tones. We did not want the tent to be too loud or in contrast with the landscape, but we also did not want it to be camouflaged or disappear. Also, yellow is a lighter and more reflective color and helps minimize heat inside the tent. Figuring out the structure was complicated. We had to consider the irregular shape of the tent and also the fragility of the rocks. We initially wanted to hold the tent up by strapping key points around the boulders, but the straps rubbed the rocks and damaged the surface. To minimize damage, we decided to use low-impact rock climbing anchors and internal tension poles to hold the tent up. The resulting tent sits lightly in the landscape both physically and visually, making one's experience using the tent primarily about the specific boulders and local ecosystem and less about the gear.
The tent is temporary and only briefly becomes part of the landscape, unlike typical human building or architecture that has a permanent impact. This project explores the concept of rewilding, reintroducing humans into the natural world. After all, we are part of the animal kingdom. It also parallels nomadic traditions like those of some native people in the Joshua Tree area. The landscape here is so extreme that it challenges the idea of permanence. Nomads typically move seasonally but return regularly to specific locations. They do not claim dominion over the landscape, but live and move with it. Terra Incognita Joshua Tree is similarly temporary but site-specific and encourages a more primordial connection to the landscape. Working on this project challenged us to become truly immersed and familiar with this one specific boulder pile. We plan to make this project public-facing so that others can hike to the site and use the tent and spend time in the high desert. With Terra Incognita, we also want to question the idea of an art experience and make participating in art more real and actually challenging and immersive.
Terra Incognita is a performative sculpture project and series of tents that are each temporarily activated in a unique wilderness or potentially urban location, immersing the user in the environmental specificity of a particular site. Each iteration highlights the micro within the macro and explores concepts of shelter. The project is experiential in that when the user activates the tent, they become a performer, and their experience within nature, using the framework of the tent, becomes the art itself.
Well, as you probably heard there, we are back. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn the conversation over to Em, who's going to lead us through the next portion of the program. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here today. First and foremost, I'm going to follow Bernard and read a land acknowledgement statement since I am here in New York City along with Georgia and Sebastian. We acknowledge that New York City is sited on the unceded territory of the Lenni Lenape tribe and that Manhattan derives from the original Lenni Lenape name for this land, Mannahatta. We respect the history of this site and we are grateful to be the current inhabitants of this place. Okay, so first of all, thank you to Bernard for having me today, and thank you to Georgia and Sebastian for inviting me to collaborate with them on this incredible work. Again, my name is M. Joseph. I'm an artist, educator, and filmmaker based in Brooklyn, and I've had the wonderful opportunity of visiting the Terra Incognita Joshua Tree site back in April and working with Georgia and Sebastian on documenting this project. So I don't know, Georgia and Sebastian, if you want to say a little bit before we get into the discussion.
Yeah, well, we'll at least say who we are.
Yeah. Thank you, Em. I'm Georgia, and I'm a painter from New York. And this is...
I'm Sebastian. I'm from Slovenia originally. I'm a designer and maker and builder of things, and I'm also based in New York currently.
Cool. Well, one of my favorite aspects of this collaboration is that it was actually one of the first things that we talked about when we first became friends, I think 3 or 4 years ago. And so it's just really special to have traveled with you guys to collaborate in this way. And so I'd like to actually start the conversation with the end of the film. And so I'm sure many of you noticed when you were watching the film that the credits were quite long, which for me as a filmmaker was kind of a strange approach, but the shot of watching Georgia and Sebastian approach the site and kind of descend into the landscape is kind of a big part of their project, which they mentioned in the film, but is this idea of scale and working with the macro and the micro and seeing these things as they kind of interchange. And I really liked this shot as a way of kind of giving context to the landscape, but also exploring this idea of scale visually and also even emotionally. So I thought, Georgia and Sebastian, that could be a great place for you guys to start kind of contextualizing the scale of this project, how scale came into it, and how you got started, and then how you were able to zero in on this very exacting location.
Yeah, like Em said, scale along with rewilding were kind of the two main themes of this project. And scale became this kind of framework through which we approached the design process, as well as citing our project or where the tent was going to go. Again, like she said, it was an investigation of the micro within the macro. If any of you have ever been out to Joshua Tree, there's simultaneously this kind of scalelessness, while at the same time, if you're in the park and the boulders or like crawling around on these places, it's very human scale as well. Yeah, it's like about looking inwards while being in this expanse or finding the specific condition within the pattern, within the field.
Yeah, I mean, being from the East Coast, and and being from a dense city and coming out to such an extreme landscape, the openness, the vistas, the barren landscape is so extreme, and it's such a sensory experience. And then, like Sebastian said, you get in and among the boulders, and it becomes really words. And so the project and the design really kind of became that, looking again like in the micro within the macro.
Yeah, we had been out to Joshua Tree a number of times together for more recreational purposes, and kind of fell in love with that condition. Again, living in the city, you never have this expanse. You're never confronted with this vastness. I mean, when we look out of our window, we see something that's 75 feet away, and that seems far. Yeah, and then going into this place where the vastness is so extreme that it kind of flattens into one plane and there's no sense of distance, was just really fascinating to us. And so we ended up just going back a number of times, even before we started this project, just because we had this pull and that, like, related to that vastness, like Georgia said, when you're in the boulders, there's this intimacy, and it kind of plays into everybody's innate kind of curiosity. Like, you know, when you're a kid and you're somewhere where you can like crawl around in things or build forts, or it's an issue of scale, and kind of I think it's rooted in human nature and kind of gets into the need for shelter. Yeah, and I was just going to say that kind of excitement of being in the boulders and kind of realizing that it's related to this childlike need for exploration and building forts and stuff is partially what inspired us to pursue this project in the first place. So.
And can you talk a little bit about how you arrived at this particular site, kind of what the process was, and were there I know there were other sites you were considering, and kind of what, again, was it about this, and what was that process?
Well, once we were introduced to Bernard and we sort of proposed the project, and he invited us to realize it, and we came out to BoxoPROJECTS, we realized that his land was connected or just adjacent to BLM land, which was also connected to conservation land and the national park. And it just became this like perfect place to explore and to scout for sites. It kind of it allowed for camping and all these other parameters that we had to consider, and so yeah, within just the Boxo backyard, we were able to kind of scramble around all these different types of land, and then considering, and then one of them kind of fit the bill because it was flat, it was shaded, it was human scale, it wasn't obstructing any like flora or fauna. What else?
Yeah, we had defined a series of parameters of what to look for in a site, and one of them being accessibility, which we ended up finding a lot out about the complexities of public versus private land in Joshua Tree, and I guess that's indicative of the United States in general. And like in the national park, you can't really camp wherever you want. You're pretty limited where you can go. And luckily in BLM land, it's fairly open.
Which is the Bureau of Land Management, for anyone who doesn't know what that stands for.
Yeah. And so we had this conveniently located, pretty large section of BLM land right behind BoxoPROJECTS that we were exploring. And yeah, like Georgia said, like it needed to be human scale, like big enough for a couple people to sleep in. It needed to provide shelter and shade and shelter from the wind. And it also, one of the harder elements or like parameters to find was that it needed to be flat and, you know, open. And we found a handful of sites, and one kind of fit the bill. exceedingly, and that's where we ended up executing the project.
Great. And this might seem like kind of a simple question, but why use your tent? Why is this different or kind of exceptional from just normal camping?
Yeah,
It's a good question.
yeah. I mean, it's not very different from a camping trip. It does live on this border between or boundary between a camping trip and an art experience. I mean, the fact that you can't use the tent anywhere else makes it more unique. And it's held up by the structure of the rocks. It's, yeah, just the whole, like, I guess the curated experience, hiking to the site, setting up the tent, like the art experience takes place within the boulders. So it relies on the context of the site.
Yeah, it's a lot deeper of an immersion than one would typically have in a camping experience. I mean, the typical American camping experience is like somebody basically having a slightly better view and cleaner air than their like normal living situation, but they take as many amenities as they can with them.
Mm-hmm.
And this is kind of bringing up the idea of rewilding. This is kind of forcing the human back into the animal kingdom in like a much more specific way. And
yeah, like it has a vista, but it's almost like it's like an anti-vista because it's more about the inward vista.
Yeah, it's about the focus of one's body within this boulder and rather than purely recreation.
Yeah, well, I mean, just to speak a little bit about my experience of the project and of the site. So I had never visited the California desert, let alone Joshua Tree, before I came out to work with you guys. I've, seen images and spoken to you about your experiences out there as you were prototyping and doing research. But the project for me was this just incredible pathway. When before I arrived to Joshua Tree, I had no kind of conception of what the landscape would be like. And your work was really a gift for me because it allowed me to enter the landscape, but it also made the landscape more accessible to me. And I had a means of understanding it and navigating it, and then kind of starting to scratch at my own curiosity and exploratory itch. And I think that in this process of rewilding, where if I think about the Dark Mountain Project, where that term comes from, and this idea of making art that is uncivilized, it in a way is calling for this process of working backwards and bringing people back into the landscape as a means of kind of turning our approach around collectively in terms of what it means for us to relate to landscape, relate to environment. Dare I use the word nature, but it's very true. And then kind of like leaping off of my own experience, as some of you might have seen from a couple of shots in the film, we did have a group of people with us when we hiked up to the site in April, and I was would love to hear you guys speak about what it was like to have so many people with you there at the camp out that day, especially because you guys had been there so much just on your own, and that it was also, how did the site itself and the landscape kind of change and open up for you in that process?
It was awesome. It was really exciting to finally share all the work that we had been doing with our friends and colleagues and some of the people that live in the local community. And it was really special because we had been on this hike so many times, and on this particular trip we saw 2 tortoises, which is extremely rare.
We had never seen one
or
before.
tortoise, yeah. They're endangered in Joshua Tree. I know they come out in the spring, but that was really special.
Yeah.
And we finally got some feedback, so that was cool.
Yeah. This is a good opportunity for a bad pun, but it really rocked. It was real. I think the best part was that we initially set off for this to be a relatively public-facing project, and it ended up being extremely personal and inward focused. It ended up being about our repetitive, iterative, obsessive relationship with this specific site. Like we came back, like almost 10 times or something throughout the course of a few years. And it was a great opportunity to kind of take our small, every time we went, the lens was more and more and more focused, and to turn that outward, and to bring other people into it, and to kind of start to get the public aspect of the project going a little bit.
Mm-hmm. And that also makes me think about this idea of leave no trace. So I know that that's something that you guys really work to preserve, but part of the tent kind of keeping its shape are these kind of climbing anchors that you use on the boulders to suspend the tent, and kind of thinking about this, another pun, this tension between kind of what is necessary to construct shelter, to make a landscape habitable, or even thinking about the perspective of being more comfortable. If you guys could talk about some of the decisions you made. I mean, not really about the nitty-gritty of installing climbing anchors, because those things exist all over the Joshua Tree landscape, but what is that tension between keeping something totally wild and then making it be able to kind of cradle a more human experience?
Yeah, and a big element of that is just I don't know what it is what shelter, the role of shelter is, and like how is that achieved? Like how does a human in particular feel sheltered? And like, yeah, we could just drop a pin to this spot and just tell people to go spend the night, sleep cowboy style out in the wilderness, open air. But again, going back to the idea of rewilding, there's a certain element, or like a certain level of kind of just inherent human needs to design and build something that ameliorates their, and like kind of conditions their existence within a place. And kind of having a background of an architect, I mean, the whole entire condition, and leaving no trace is a lofty goal for humans, as we can see when we look around us. But this project, we wanted to try to get as close to that as possible. And like you brought up, the climbing anchors were a pretty big decision. It was nearly impossible to be completely traceless. And that was a compromise and like a very deliberate decision. And we had a lot of research and how we ended up coming to that. But that landscape, though it is very barren and harsh and extreme, I think the more extreme and barren and harsh a landscape is, the more fragile it is on that surface micro level. And so we had to balance how to be in this landscape as lightly as possible and as temporarily as possible. And the Leave No Trace guidelines are
their set of principles. It's their outdoor ethics to promote the conservation of the outdoors. And
Yeah.
original prototype of.
I was just gonna say, typically for recreational purposes,
Right.
for like people that are backpacking or camping or, you know, doing any number of fun things in the woods.
Yeah, and our prototype had straps that wrapped around the boulders, and we realized that these straps were causing the rock surface to crumble. And in Joshua Tree, the rocks have this biocrust, which is extremely important. It's like a living skin. It protects this underlayer of living organisms like lichen and fungi and just other living organisms. And that helps kind of retain or absorb moisture. So you really don't want to mess with it.
There are these really delicate kind of ecosystems. Like the cryptobiotic soil is like one that a lot of people know about. It's like very fragile. And we just wanted to impact that element as little as possible. Like a lot of people think a rock is super durable and doesn't matter what you do to it, but it was really interesting to learn about this much more nuanced
Well, I mean, there are very few examples of human experience on this earth where like a mark is not made, even with the most kind of holistic indigenous practices. A part of their kind of communion with the landscape is one that exists out of a reverence for an understanding for the fact that they take from it and use from it to survive. So it's, you know, I think it's in terms of this acknowledgement of what it means to be a nomad and to think back on means of survival. I think that, you know, the process of locating the most, the least destructive means, and also the one that could also have the most longevity for other people to use in the future was a really great and kind of genius solution. So, and kind of thinking about this idea of permanence and impermanence, is your work in Joshua Tree done, or are you guys ready to move on to the next location, or is there more for you in the desert?
We love the desert and we love going to Joshua Tree, and having been out there fairly regularly for the last few years, I kind of feel like we're not quite tourists anymore. We'd like to maintain a relationship with the community that we built out there. And we don't want this project to be finished. I mean, also, it can't ever be finished because the kind of parameters of the environment at the site are constantly shifting and changing. Like we came back the next to last time that we were out there, the wind was coming from a completely different direction. And so we learned something new about how we would have to structure the tent. There's all this sand in the area that wasn't there before. And so it's constantly changing. So if we do want this to be potentially a public facing project, those are the kind of things, there's a certain level of maintenance, which is kind of interesting to think about in any design project. But yeah, there's a certain amount of maintenance that would need to be done, which we're hoping will bring us out more often. And we're still working on how to make it public facing. Obviously, there's some things that need to be considered. It's not the easiest hike. It's relatively remote, and it's a strenuous hike, and you have to consider the elements. It gets hot, it's dry. And so those are some kind of hurdles and they need to just be considered when making a public facing piece of art, but we're working on that. Mm-hmm. And then we have some other locations and iterations of the larger Terra Incognita project in the works. Georgia,
hopefully there's something alpine, or maybe even something urban. I think that would be kind of challenging. We are very inspired by a work of art by an artist named Michael Rakowitz, this project called Parasite, which is a series of inflatable shelters for homeless people that hook up to HVAC systems and building vents. And yeah, it would be definitely a challenge and kind of interesting to do something like maybe in New York City where we live and work. So yeah, we're thinking about it.
Yeah,
and we're excited.
We have some relationships in Montana, and we spend a lot of time in Vermont, and they're increasingly spending more time in Vermont. So in terms of natural places, I think the next one will be a more alpine place. Like I was born on top of a mountain in the Slovenian Alps, pretty near the Austrian border. So this like real interest in that landscape.
And maybe a different weather condition to contend
very
with.
different parameters.
Yeah.
And also George and I are members of this design collective called City Group that investigates the housing issues, and specifically in New York City, but just larger issues of housing and kind of the politics around that. And that got us thinking about Terra Incognita in a more urban condition, and also just rewilding and how that can, the degrees of rewilding, like you brought up, and how
you're very familiar with the landscape. And so, you know, I think this is something that we're all kind of struggling with in terms of a kind of collective American, New York, or even California idea of whose land is whose. And I was wondering if you could just talk about the process of kind of negotiating this idea of access and you know, space, and do you guys see yourselves as guardians over the site, or how in the long term do you kind of operate in terms of this specific site and your relationship to it?
We definitely don't want to claim ownership over the land, and we want to be careful about some sort of like proprietary engagement. But like the history of the desert, or the culture on the desert, has this nomadic history, and it feels sort of acceptable to kind of come in a temporary way, settle in a temporary way. I don't know if you want to.
Yeah. Nobody really chooses where they're from.
Yeah.
And so there's like being from somewhere and making work where you're from is a pretty interesting topic, I guess. But it's been really exciting going to a place just initially for the same reason why a lot of people go to Joshua Tree, because it's this wild place they learn about from a U2 album cover. And then, I don't know, just general kind of like consumption, recreation, and then going and realizing that it's much, much more than that. And then becoming temporarily and briefly intimate with this one specific place. And like, we don't claim any ownership of it any more than we do claim ownership of any like spot that our foot rests on while we're walking. Like it's a brief engagement with this place, and we hope that it becomes, that it can be a kind of an inspiration and a structure for other people to realize how to live more lightly, and how to explore more lightly, and how to engage in a place kind of independent of the idea of ownership and permanence.
Yeah. I mean, I think that idea is really inspiring, and that's kind of what I'm left with in this project. And it kind of, was this while I was working with the footage and in conversation with you guys back here in New York, and thinking about how I can apply these principles to my everyday. And I think it would be really great to have a Terra Incognita here in New York. So hopefully that will happen. So.
Yeah. Well, do you have anything to add more about your experience with the project, or?
Yeah, I mean, California in general is very kind of very interesting to me. Going back to this idea of scale, even if you kind of leave New York City and travel throughout New England or even in upstate New York, the scale of the landscape is very different. The East Coast is extremely, extremely condensed. So my experience of California is always this one, as you mentioned earlier, of just this incredible expansiveness and also variety. I just had the best time as a photographer and a filmmaker, because the experience and the film was kind of unfolding before me. But then there was also this intimacy that I referred to earlier, where when we arrived at the site, I by way of your practice and your sensitivity and the time that you had spent with the landscape, I had so much to work with in terms of what the site had to offer, how the tent was constructed, and visually and conceptually, it was just so much fun to work with. And my experience of the site was one of complete fresh newness. And then as we continued to revisit the site and visit the surrounding areas, I became more familiar. And even after finishing the film, I'm still doing my due diligence to understand Joshua Tree. And in the least, you've left me with a great excitement to return and hopefully spend a night in the tent and take it from there. So.
Great. Well, thank you so much for the pleasure hosting you here. And I have to say, going forward, if you need to come back and do maintenance, you're always welcome back here. I wanted to address that just briefly in my way, that question of ownership. I think one of the beautiful things that I learned when I moved out west from the East is about BLM land. And despite its kind of dark history, today it is a place in terms of ownership that anybody has access to and can really inhabit for up to 14 days at a time. And I think not many people know about that. This kind of unrestricted access to millions of acres of land, and particularly at a time when that land is ultimately under the management of a person of indigenous background. It's a great moment, for us to think about. We don't quite own it, and yet we do, or at least we have as free access to BLM land as I think there is to open land anywhere. So for anybody from the East, come on out and take 14 days. There are a couple of questions from the viewers which I wanted to bring up. So one of the questions follows up on M's question about whether the installation is any different from camping. And the question is, aren't you ultimately really elevating the camping trip to an artistic experience?
In a way, yes. It's kind of you can think about it as like a level of resolution or detail being immersive on another degree, where it kind of transcends being just purely recreational. And I think that's where it comes into the realm of art.
Great.
Yeah.
And another question, that it's interesting that the tent is a nomadic structure, but it's been made only suitable for a single location. What did this teach you about the material and structural aspects of this type of shelter?
I think the video gets into that. One key element about the difference between a nomad and a drifter or a traveler is that nomads tend to be relatively, they follow patterns. They go to similar places or the same place with climatic conditions and changes in seasons, things like that. And so, yeah, it is in just the same, it's in the one place. I mean, it's kind of like how shepherds have huts that they go from one place to another. and that hut is specific to that climate. But I guess I'll talk to the materials a little bit. We looked at just traditional backpacking tents, or like modern backpacking tents, and have a rapidly, easily deployable and lightweight, mobile and impermanent structure. And then I think over many years and centuries, the language and the materiality of that has evolved to be relatively efficient. And so we adopted that language, but just made it fit within this void, within these boulders, that it won't work anywhere else, and to kind of really kind of marry it to this idea of specificity.
Great, thanks. Another couple of questions, I guess. One, maybe a Christo reference, which is, are you going to start to wrap the stone around the site?
No.
And did the experience of working on the project affect the dynamics between the two of you as the creators?
Did the experience affect our dynamic?
Oh, I think it brought us closer and challenged our own individual art practices.
Yeah, we've collaborated in the past many times. We have pretty overlapping interests, and when it comes to kind of environmental issues and just design. And this was definitely challenging at times. Like, we have different skill sets, and there were elements of the project in which neither of us had the experience for. And so there's always friction when you're learning something together, but that friction was exciting, and it definitely brought us better. The next iteration of this project, it'll be that much smoother.
I think a project like this also benefits from having two different people with different skill sets. I think. Yeah,
multiple perspectives are always good for.
And bringing Em in, like, it just brought everything to a whole another level. Like, we didn't expect that, and that was great.
Yeah, it definitely challenged us to be able to better articulate these kind of unrefined concepts that were driving this project. Not that they were unrefined, they were just we had never had to like say them out loud and explain them to somebody, and so that was a really good challenge. And it went from being like we have a friend making a video for us to be truly a collaboration. So thanks, Em, for that.
And you just have this responsibility to one another, like one person puts in effort in one way, and then you have to give back. Like, I don't know, the whole concept of the piece, like we're still challenged by how to make it public facing, or how to tread lightly on the landscape. It's a symbiotic kind of give and take. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you all very much. Thank you to everyone who joined us today. We look forward to the next iteration of Terra Incognita, and perhaps checking in with another film and episode. And thanks very much for leading that conversation. And I also wanted to thank Amy Boyer, the Boxo program coordinator, who's been in the background helping us with production on this meeting and so much else. So thank you all, and have a great week ahead. Look forward to seeing you again.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.